The sun was setting when I arrived at the old farmstead, my grandfather's place. Isolated, decaying, and tucked away at the end of a long, dirt road few knew existed. I hadn't been back since I was a kid, but after Grandpa's passing, it was my responsibility to sort out the house and land. The memories of the farm always seemed shrouded in the haze of childhood, too distant and vague to feel real. The fields that stretched endlessly around the house, the barn with its peeling red paint, the rusted windmill creaking in the wind. It was as if they existed in a dream half forgotten. But standing there now, it felt very real, and very wrong. I killed the engine of my truck, the sudden silence filling the air like a heavy blanket. The fields around me were empty, the cornstalks long gone, leaving only barren earth. The wind was still, unnaturally so, the kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breath, your own heart beating in your chest. I grabbed my bag from the passenger seat, hesitated for a moment, then locked the truck out of habit. As I approached the house, the overwhelming sense of abandonment hit me. The porch steps creaked under my weight, and when I reached for the front door, it swung open without resistance. Inside, it was as though time had frozen. The furniture was covered in a thick layer of dust, the same old plaid armchair by the fireplace, the same crooked picture frames on the wall. It was all just as I remembered, but there was something else, a feeling that settled deep in my gut, a feeling that I wasn't alone. I dropped my bag by the door and ventured deeper into the house, each step echoing through the empty rooms. The kitchen still had the smell of rotting wood and old earth, and I found myself avoiding the window that looked out toward the barn. The barn always unsettled me, even as a kid. There was something about its shadow, the way it loomed over the property, watching everything. The night was fast approaching, so I decided to start with the attic. Grandpa had kept everything up there, old papers, keepsakes, things that needed sorting. I didn't want to sleep in the house without first making sure there weren't rats or something worse hiding in the walls. I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step groaning in protest. The door at the top was ajar, and when I pushed it open, a musty smell hit me, thick and suffocating. I coughed and waved my hand in front of my face, stepping inside. The attic was packed, boxes stacked haphazardly, old furniture covered with sheets, tools, and gadgets of a bygone era scattered about. The single bulb overhead flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced with every flicker. I tried to focus on the task at hand, picking through boxes of old photos, paperwork, and journals. But as I worked, that feeling persisted, the gnawing sensation that I was being watched. Then I heard it, a faint sound coming from below, like a door creaking open. I froze, listening. The house groaned, but I told myself it was the wind, the old wood settling. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was down there. I hurried through the rest of the boxes, heart pounding in my chest. Finally, after what felt like hours, I found what I was looking for, Grandpa's old journal. I stuffed it into my bag, eager to get out of the attic and away from the suffocating atmosphere. As I descended the stairs, the house seemed even quieter, as though it had been holding its breath. I stepped into the living room, and that's when I saw it. The front door was wide open. A cold chill ran down my spine. I was sure I had closed it. I hadn't heard any footsteps, no sound of someone entering the house. And yet, the door stood open, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I stood frozen, staring at the doorway, my mind racing. Should I check outside? Should I lock it and pretend nothing had happened? A part of me wanted to leave, get in the truck and drive away, far from this place. But another part of me, the rational part, insisted that I was overreacting. It was just the wind. The door had probably never latched properly. I moved toward the door, but before I could close it, something caught my eye, something moving in the field. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fading light. But no, there was definitely something or someone walking through the field, a figure, barely visible against the dusky sky, moving slowly, deliberately, just beyond the reach of the porch light. I watched, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure walked in a straight line, unhurried, as though it knew exactly where it was going, toward the barn. I slammed the door shut, bolting it with shaking hands. I backed away, unable to tear my eyes from the window. The figure had disappeared into the darkness, but the unease it left behind lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe a neighbor, someone passing through. But deep down, I knew better. There were no neighbors. No one had lived near the farm in years. I decided I wouldn't stay in the house that night. I'd sleep in the truck just to be safe. I grabbed my bag, slipped on my jacket, and stepped outside, locking the door behind me. The air was colder than before, a biting chill that cut through my clothes. I hurried toward the truck, glancing over my shoulder at the barn. The door was open, swaying gently in the wind. I jumped into the truck, locked the doors, and settled into the driver's seat. The cold from the windows seeped in, but I didn't care. I felt safer here, with the door between me and whatever was out there. I pulled out Grandpa's journal, hoping to distract myself. The old, leather-bound book creaked as I opened it. The pages yellowed with age. The entries were written in his familiar, scrawling handwriting, but the further I read, the more disjointed and paranoid they became. Mentions of strange occurrences on the farm, things moving in the night, shadows that didn't belong. The last entry sent a shiver down my spine. They come at night, from the fields. They watch, waiting. Don't go into the barn. I stared at the words, the cold dread creeping over me. Suddenly, a tap on the window jolted me, and my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. My heart hammered in my chest, a primal terror gripping me as I stared at the window. The tap had been faint, almost polite, but in the stillness of the night, it was deafening. I sat frozen, clutching Grandpa's journal to my chest, my mind racing. I couldn't bring myself to turn my head, too afraid of what I might see looking back at me. For a few agonizing moments, there was silence. Then, another tap, sharper this time, as if whoever or whatever was outside was growing impatient. I forced myself to move, inching my head just enough to glance out of the corner of my eye. There, standing at the edge of the window, was a face, pale, almost featureless, with hollow eyes that seemed to absorb the light. It was too close, its breath fogging the glass as it stared directly at me. I gasped and jerked back, my hand fumbling for the truck's ignition. The face didn't move. It simply stood there, unmoving, watching me with those hollow, dead eyes. My fingers finally found the keys, and I twisted them with trembling hands. The engine sputtered but refused to start. "Come on! Come on!" I whispered, turning the key again. The truck groaned, but the engine wouldn't catch. Panic surged through me. I glanced back at the window, and the figure was gone. Just like that, as if it had never been there. But I knew better. Something was out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel in frustration, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The truck wasn't going to save me. I was stranded. I had two options: stay in the truck and hope whatever was outside didn't come back, or make a run for the house. The house at least had walls and locks. But that figure, it had been watching me. How long had it been standing there? Was it alone? The barn door was still swaying in the wind, casting long shadows across the field. I couldn't shake the feeling that the barn was important, that there was something hidden there, something connected to the warnings in Grandpa's journal. Don't go into the barn. I shoved the journal into my bag and grabbed the flashlight from the glove compartment. If I was going to make a run for the house, I needed to be prepared. The flashlight flickered weakly as I turned it on, but it was better than nothing. I opened the truck door as quietly as I could, stepping out into the cold night air. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft rustle of dry leaves in the wind. I scanned the area around the truck, but there was no sign of the figure. It had vanished, melting into the shadows like a ghost. With my heart pounding in my ears, I started toward the house, moving quickly but cautiously. Every step felt like a gamble, as though something was watching my every move, waiting for me to slip up. I kept the flashlight trained ahead, sweeping it across the path, the beam cutting through the darkness. I was halfway to the porch when I heard it, a faint rustling sound. like someone walking through dry grass. I stopped, holding my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. My hands tightened around the flashlight, and I slowly turned to face the field. There, in the distance, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the field, motionless, their heads tilted slightly to one side as if they were listening to something I couldn't hear. They were just shapes, dark and indistinct, barely visible in the moonlight. But their presence was undeniable. They were watching me. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the nearest figure. The beam illuminated a pale face, smooth, featureless, with hollow eyes that reflected the light like glass. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. There was no way I could make it to the house without passing them. They were too close. Panic surged through me, and before I knew what I was doing, I turned and ran. My feet pounded against the dirt, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. The field stretched out endlessly around me, the figures unmoving but ever-present. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see if I did. I reached the house, throwing myself onto the porch and slamming against the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, shaking so badly I could barely turn the key. The door swung open, and I stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind me. The silence inside was deafening. I leaned against the door, my chest heaving, listening for any sign of movement outside. But there was nothing. No footsteps, no voices, just the low creak of the windmill in the distance. I locked the door, bolting it for good measure, and then sank to the floor. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. What were those things? People? Creatures? Something else entirely? I pulled out Grandpa's journal again, flipping through the pages. There had to be something, some explanation for what was happening. The further I read, the more frantic his handwriting became. He spoke of visitors, figures in the fields, watching the house from the darkness, just as I had seen. He wrote about their eyes, those hollow, empty eyes that seemed to see everything. "They come from the barn," he wrote. "They always come from the barn." A loud creak from above made me jump. The attic. Something was up there. My heart raced, and I stood slowly, my legs trembling beneath me. I hadn't checked the attic since I'd come inside. The thought of going back up there made my skin crawl, but I couldn't just ignore it. Whatever was up there had made itself known. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way to the narrow staircase. The old wood groaned under my weight as I climbed, every step filling me with dread. When I reached the attic door, I paused, listening. For a moment, there was nothing, just the silence of the house around me. Then I heard it, a faint scratching sound, coming from behind the door. I swallowed hard, gripping the doorknob with one hand, the flashlight in the other. My palm was slick with sweat as I turned the knob, pushing the door open. The attic was just as I'd left it, cluttered, dusty, and bathed in the dim light from the single bulb overhead. I swept the flashlight across the room, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing, no figures, no movement, just the same old boxes and furniture covered in dust. But then I saw it. The attic window. It was open, the curtains swaying gently in the breeze. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. I hadn't opened that window. I was sure of it. I stepped closer, the flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached the window, I noticed something on the floor. Footprints. Small, pale footprints, leading from the window to the far corner of the attic. I followed them, my heart racing. The footprints stopped at an old wardrobe, its door slightly ajar. I reached out, my hand shaking, and pulled the door open. Inside, crouched in the darkness, was a child. A little girl, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes hollow and dark. She looked up at me, her mouth moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. The girl slowly stood, her movements unnaturally stiff, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. She stepped out of the wardrobe, her head tilted to one side, just like the figures in the field. Then, in the dim light, I saw the truth. Her eyes weren't just hollow. They were empty, completely empty. She took a step toward me, her mouth still moving silently. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I turned and ran, slamming the attic door behind me and racing down the stairs. My heart was pounding, the blood roaring in my ears. I stumbled through the house, making for the front door, but as I reached for the lock, I froze. Through the window, I saw them, the figures from the field, standing at the edge of the porch, their hollow eyes fixed on the house. They weren't watching the house anymore. They were watching me. I stood frozen, staring through the window at the figures that had gathered just beyond the porch. They were still, their hollow eyes locked onto me, reflecting the dim porch light like black mirrors. There were more of them now, at least a dozen, maybe more, spaced out unevenly across the yard, stretching back toward the fields. Their presence felt suffocating, as though the very air around me had thickened, trapping me inside. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I backed away from the window. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out, to do anything but stand there. But where could I go? They were everywhere, outside, in the attic, and now they were closing in. I couldn't outrun them, not in this darkness. I scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. I held the phone to my ear, praying for an answer. The ringing felt like it lasted forever, each second stretching into an eternity. Finally, a voice on the other end. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at my grandfather's farm, I stammered, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. There's something here. People, I don't know what they are, but they're surrounding the house. They're outside. Calm down, sir. The operator's voice was firm but reassuring. What's your location? Are you in immediate danger? I'm at 158 Briarfield Road. Please, you have to send someone. I glanced at the window again, the figures still staring in, unmoving. There's something wrong with them. They're not normal. Help is on the way, she assured me. Stay inside and lock all the doors. Can you describe the individuals outside? Are they trying to break in? No, they're just standing there, watching. They've been out there for... A loud thump from above cut me off, and I nearly dropped the phone. The attic. The little girl. I think there's someone in the house. I whispered, my voice trembling. There's a girl in the attic. She's not right. Stay on the line with me, sir, the operator instructed. Help is coming. Do you have any way to defend yourself? My eyes darted around the room. I have a flashlight, that's it. Barricade yourself in a room if you can. Stay calm. Officers are on their way. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and started moving toward the kitchen. The dining room table was heavy, sturdy enough that I might be able to use it to block the back door. I grabbed one end and began dragging it across the floor, wincing at the loud scraping noise it made. Thump. The sound came again, louder this time. Something, or someone, was moving in the attic, pacing back and forth. I could hear the creak of the floorboards overhead. The girl's footsteps were slow, deliberate, as though she were waiting for something. My stomach twisted in knots, the air in the house growing colder, heavier with each passing moment. I pushed the table into place against the back door, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The windows loomed large, the glass too fragile to offer any real protection. But at least the doors were locked. At least I had that. Thump, thump. I stared up at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my ears. What was she doing? Was she waiting for me to come back up? Or worse, was she coming down? A loud bang echoed from the front porch, like something striking the door. I jumped, my skin crawling with terror as I realized it was coming from the figures outside. They hadn't moved, at least not that I could see. But something was hammering at the door, slow and rhythmic, like a knock that carried an unspoken threat. Bang, bang. The door rattled with each strike. I backed away, my feet dragging against the floor. My phone was still pressed to my ear, the operator's voice distant, barely registering through my fear. Bang. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. I darted toward the stairs, nearly tripping over my own feet as I bolted up to the second floor. I needed to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they couldn't reach me. The bedroom, the closet. I didn't care, as long as it was far from the front door and whatever was hammering against it. I threw myself into the master bedroom, slamming the door behind me. The room was dark, the curtains drawn tight, but the sense of unease was stronger here. There was a presence in this room, something that lingered just out of sight, watching me. I backed away from the door, trying to catch my breath. The bed loomed large in the center of the room, the sheets untouched, as though waiting for someone to crawl beneath them. I shuddered at the thought. This had been Grandpa's room. I hadn't even considered sleeping in here, not with the way the house felt. There was something wrong with this place, something that had always been wrong, and I was only just now realizing how deep it went. I glanced around the room, my eyes falling on an old, weathered chest at the foot of the bed. It was locked, the brass hinges tarnished with age, but the key hung from a small nail on the wall. I didn't know what was inside, but something compelled me to open it, some morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. With trembling hands, I grabbed the key and knelt beside the chest. The lock clicked open with a metallic groan, and I slowly lifted the lid. Inside, there were photographs, dozens of them, yellowed and faded with time. They were all of the farm, Grandpa's farm, but in each one, there was something wrong. The fields were empty, barren, just like they were now. The barn stood tall in the distance, its door wide open. And in the background, barely visible in the shadows, were the figures. Always the figures, watching. A chill ran down my spine as I flipped through the photographs, each one showing the same thing. The house, the barn, the figures growing closer with each picture. And then I found the last one. It was a photo of me. I was standing on the front porch, looking out at the field. I couldn't have been more than 10 or 11, my face barely visible beneath the brim of my baseball cap. But what made my blood run cold was the figure standing just behind me, so close I should have felt it. I dropped the photograph, my heart pounding in my chest. How was this possible? I didn't remember this. I didn't remember anyone, anything being there. The attic door creaked open. I froze, my body going cold as I realized the little girl was coming down. The floorboards groaned under her weight, the sound impossibly loud in the silence of the house. I backed away, my eyes darting toward the window. Could I make it? Could I escape before she reached me? But then I heard it, whispering, soft, faint, like a distant breeze carrying words I couldn't quite understand. It came from the hallway, growing louder with each step the girl took. I had no choice. I bolted for the window, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the latch. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices surrounding me. I yanked the window open, the cold night air rushing in, and threw myself outside. I landed hard on the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Pain shot through my leg, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle, and limped toward the truck. The whispers followed me, echoing through the night, carried on the wind. I glanced back at the house, and there she was, the little girl, standing in the open window, her hollow eyes fixed on me. And then, behind her, the figures, dozens of them, filling the house, their faces pale and featureless. They watched me, silent and still, as if waiting for something. I stumbled into the truck, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the keys, and with a twist, the engine roared to life. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, the figures disappearing into the darkness behind me. But even as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, that they would always be watching. The headlights carved a narrow path through the night as I sped down the dirt road, the farmhouse shrinking in the rearview mirror. The figures, the little girl, the whispers. They were all behind me now, swallowed by the darkness. But the sense of dread clung to me, thick and inescapable, like a shadow that refused to let go. I kept glancing in the rearview, half expecting to see those pale faces staring back at me from the dark. But the road remained empty. The whispering had stopped, leaving only the sound of the truck's engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The silence was worse. I drove until the road ended in a small clearing, the truck's headlights illuminating the edge of the fields. This was as far as the dirt path went. The only way forward was on foot. I stopped the truck, my hands still gripping the steering wheel, and stared out into the night. The barn was out there somewhere, just beyond the reach of the lights, hidden in the shadows. A part of me wanted to turn the truck around and leave, drive as far from this place as possible and never look back. But something kept pulling me back to the barn, an unshakable feeling that whatever was happening, it all started there. Grandpa's journal was still in my bag, and his words echoed in my mind. They come from the barn. I didn't know what that meant, but I had a feeling that the answers were waiting for me inside, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. I grabbed the flashlight, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the truck. The cold night air hit me like a slap, sharp and biting, but I ignored it. My ankle throbbed from the fall, but I pushed the pain aside. I had to keep moving. The field stretched out in front of me, barren and lifeless, the cornstalks long gone. The barn loomed in the distance, its roof barely visible against the starless sky. The wind had picked up again, howling softly through the empty fields, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like whispering. I ignored it and started walking. The barn grew larger with each step, its silhouette dark and imposing. I could see the outline of the doors now, slightly ajar, just as they had been in the photos. Something about the way they hung open unsettled me, like they were waiting for me, welcoming me. The flashlight's beam flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. My breath puffed out in shallow clouds, each one dissipating into the cold night. The barn door groaned in the wind, the sound echoing through the emptiness. And as I reached the entrance, I hesitated. I shined the light into the darkened interior, revealing nothing but emptiness. The barn was old, decaying, the beams sagging under the weight of time. Dust particles floated in the air, swirling in the light. There was no sign of movement, no figures, no little girl, just the stale, oppressive silence. But I knew better than to trust the silence. I stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I moved deeper into the barn, the air thick with the smell of rot and damp wood. The flashlight flickered again, the beam growing weaker, casting only the faintest glow. I swept the light across the space, illuminating piles of hay, rusted farm tools, and the skeletal remains of an old tractor. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place, but the feeling was still there, the sense that I wasn't alone. The beam landed on a small door at the back of the barn, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It was small, barely noticeable, but something about it drew me in. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the hollow barn, the creaking of the floorboards louder than before. The door was old, much older than the rest of the barn. The wood was splintered and warped, the hinges rusted. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling, and pushed it open. A gust of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of earth. A staircase led down into the ground, disappearing into darkness. The faint whispering I had heard earlier grew louder, drifting up from below. My mind screamed at me to stop, to turn back. But I couldn't. I had come too far. Whatever was happening here, it was down there, waiting. I descended the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the walls narrowing as I moved deeper into the earth. The whispering surrounded me now, echoing off the dirt walls, overlapping voices that I couldn't understand. The flashlight's beam was weak, barely piercing the darkness ahead. I could feel the weight of the earth pressing in around me, the tunnel closing in, suffocating. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a narrow corridor. The walls were lined with old, wooden beams, but they were sagging, decayed, as if the earth itself was trying to swallow them. The whispering was louder here, clearer, though I still couldn't make out the words. It felt like the voices were all around me, coming from every direction, calling to me. I moved forward, the flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. The corridor twisted and turned, leading me deeper underground. And then, just as I was beginning to wonder if there was an end, the tunnel opened into a large, underground chamber. The room was enormous, the ceiling lost in darkness. The floor was made of packed dirt, and in the center of the room stood a large, stone altar. Surrounding the altar were figures, dozens of them, just like the ones I'd seen in the field. Pale, hollow-eyed figures, their faces blank and featureless. They stood motionless, their heads tilted slightly to the side, watching me. At the far end of the room, I saw her, the little girl. She was standing behind the altar, her hollow eyes locked onto mine, her mouth moving silently. She raised a hand, and the whispering grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled the chamber, pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figures, the girl, the altar. It was all wrong. I shouldn't be here. I didn't belong here. But the girl didn't move. She just stood there, her hands still raised, the whispering growing louder and louder until it was deafening. I pressed my hands to my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head, filling every corner of my mind, drowning out my thoughts. And then, suddenly, the whispering stopped. The silence was so abrupt, so complete, that it left my ears ringing. I lowered my hands, blinking against the oppressive darkness. The figures were still there, watching, waiting. And then the girl spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper, but it echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. My throat was dry, my chest tight with fear. "They are waiting," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "They've always been waiting." I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, but my feet wouldn't move. The girl stepped forward, her hollow eyes locked onto mine. "They wait for you." With that, the figures moved. Slowly at first, but then with increasing speed. They surged toward me, their pale faces blank, their hands reaching out. I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around me as I raced back toward the stairs. The whispering returned, louder than before, filling my mind with unintelligible words. I could feel them behind me, their cold hands brushing against my skin, pulling me back into the darkness. I reached the stairs, scrambling up them as fast as I could, the whispering rising to a deafening roar. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't stop, couldn't stop. I burst out of the barn, the cold night air hitting me like a wall. I stumbled, collapsing onto the ground, gasping for breath. The whispering stopped, replaced by the quiet rustling of the wind in the empty fields. The barn door stood wide open behind me, but there were no figures, no little girl. Just the dark, silent interior, waiting. I didn't wait. I got to my feet, limping toward the truck as fast as I could. The engine roared to life, and I sped away from the farm, the barn shrinking in the rearview mirror. As I drove, I glanced at the mirror one last time. In the distance, standing in the field, I saw them, the figures, watching me. They were always watching.